Um, and after a while, I'm going to start screaming. I want to bring in my guests. I'm joined with the one and only KJ No. KJ No is a political journalist. I'm sorry, is a journalist, political analyst, writer, teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. How you doing, KJ? You doing okay today?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you.
It is good to have you, my man. Sanctions. Trump has leveled 20% sanctions on China. Now, China has come out very strong and said, we are ready for any war, economic, militarily, or otherwise, effectively. Don't F with us. Now, Mark Ross, he's an economist. He was here a little bit earlier. He made a really good point. If Trump really wanted to have a sanctions war with China, those sanctions would have been 100%. 20%. It's not overtly significant. Or is it? Give me your take on this. What's going on?
Well, I think, it's like any situation where there's contestation. You don't want to put everything out on the board at once. You want to slowly raise the heat in this specific situation. So I don't think that Trump wants an overt sanctions war with China because, as I've said before, Trump will lose that sanctions war. But he is strongly influenced by a neo-mercantile policy. And that neo-mercantilism, involves working for a trade surplus or at least a balance of trade. There's strong protectionist elements of his policy. There's also all about, export controls, etc. And so he really has this strong economic nationalist approach to China. And as I said before, it's not going to work. The current trade surplus with China is a few $100 million. Sorry, about $500 billion. That is the GDP of one of China's major cities. It's not that important for China. China can go to the mat on this. And so this is why they said, and this is extraordinary language from the Chinese administration. They said, intimidation does not scare us. Bullying does not work on us. Pressuring, coercion, or threats are not the right way of dealing with China. And then they said, if you want a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. We urge the US to stop being domineering and return to the right track of dialogue and cooperation at an early date. It doesn't get any clearer than that. And certainly the Chinese government is not prone to making these kinds of statements. It's very, very strong. And I think they're making it very clear that we will not be pushed around. And that's probably the right approach for the Chinese government as far as their interests are concerned.
There we are. Yeah, they're being very strong on this. They don't seem to be willing to take a lesson from Trump this time around. And I would imagine this is the second time Trump has done this. And I was looking at some of the reports. Farmers have been taking a massive hit in the United States. And obviously, they're taking this massive hit because of the policies that Donald Trump is pushing through. And Trump is acting like, yeah, there may be a little bit of chaos, but it's not going to be that bad. Okay, well, that's not really the case. Um, right? I was looking for the article. I can't find the article, but right here. Yeah, right here. This is what we are effectively dealing with Donald Trump's policies. U.S. farm bankruptcy surged 24% on strain from Trump's trade war. Farmers increasingly dependent on federal aid, crop insurances. Bankruptcies rise to the highest since 2011, the farm group says. Okay, so if he doesn't want a trade war, what does he actually want?
He wants China to back down. He wants China to be pliable. He wants China to support, his national rejuvenation based on, his policies. Now, once again, it's not going to happen. China has its own interests. They are offering and tendering the hand to U.S. in win-win cooperation. They're saying, both of us can win. And as far as the US is concerned, the current global system works for it as far as it's concerned, because
Right.
it gets stuff from China for free. The only thing that it has to give back to China, what China has built with tremendous, hard work and, industry, the US can simply reimburse China with paper. They just print this paper. It costs them nothing, or they, electronically create it. That's all they have to do. And so this is actually an advantageous deal for the United States. But because Trump has some very neo-mercantilist thinking in his own administration, and probably in himself, he doesn't want that current state of affairs. Now, there's one piece in which he's not wrong, and that is that he is seeing that the current system is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the United States. Certainly, it's not sustainable for the world. And I think both China and the Trump administration have realized this. Let me give you an analogy. In 1991, or starting 1989, and then, really kind of hitting its pace in 1991, the United States started crowing that it had defeated the Soviet Union. That
End of history.
it was
Yeah.
the end of history, right?
Yeah.
Capitalism, liberal, capitalism had defeated those evil communists. Now, let me give you an analogy. In 1982, there was a Korean boxer. His name was Bae Ki-sung, and he fought a Japanese fighter called Kenji Yonekura, and he dominated the fight. He thrashed him over 10 rounds. He completely dominated him. And then at the end of 10 rounds, he won unanimously. So, went back home, celebrated. And then he collapsed. And then 3 days later, he was dead from, subdural hematoma, brain damage.
Yeah.
And in a certain sense, we can think about, the USSR contestation to be a bit like this. There was this crowing that the US had defeated communism and the USSR. But actually, both had been defeated. And the US, and in particular US capitalism, was on a downward spiral. It really kind of ran out of gas in the 1970s and was being propped up through a series of, extraordinary measures. And by the time we hit the 90s, it was essentially a done deal. And in 2008, the French president came out, Sarkozy, and said, laissez-faire, c'est fini. Capitalism is finished, right? He said, it's all over. We're dead. And he was an, extreme conservative, but he was making the right observation. The system is not working. If you have any doubt about this, just step outside, look around, look at all the immiseration. Ask yourself if this is a system that is working. Nothing works anymore. None of the corporations work anymore. They just gouge and cheat. That's what's happening.
Yeah. But KJ, you made the point. You said pieces of paper for products, and you said the current state of affairs is good, but it's not. I mean, like, that's one of the arguments that people make about NAFTA. It's like we gutted our own work base in order to send products to the Philippines, to Mexico, to China. And then it's like, okay, so the guy in China who makes $5 an hour, well, in the US, he was making 15. And so, yeah, we get a cheap product, but we also now have somebody who's without a job and is working in a service job. It's a negative for us in the way that we're looking at it. Donald Trump, look, I'm a lefty, right? It's the way I look at the world. From our point of view, or from my point of view, this arrangement of globalism has not been to our benefit. And I know why the US did it. After the Second World War, we were the only game in town. And so from our point of view, yeah, we want our products all over the globe. We love globalism. It's great because this is a game that we can win. And then when China comes in and all of a sudden it's like is better at it, well, at that point now we have issues, right? But at this point, it's been going on for like 50 years. And you have all these people who are now working service jobs making pittance of a wage that they were making at a factory at one point. And they feel some kind of way. And you can make a case that Donald Trump is the avatar of those people. Now, whether or not he could be successful in pulling the jobs back, I'm skeptical. But that is his point of view. Give me your take on that. I mean, do you think that's true or false? I mean, like, I can tell you this, a factory worker who's making $20 an hour and who loses this job because the factory is sent to China, Philippines, Mexico, Malaysia, whatever. And they pay the worker $3, $5, and they sell a product for 10. Okay, well, that guy has lost his job. Yes, the product is cheaper, so you can buy it for $4, but he is unemployed now, or he's working at 7-Eleven, or he's driving Uber. That is not a net win in the way that we look at it. But correct me if I'm wrong. Give me your take.
No, you're not wrong. And that Uber driver will very soon be out of a job too once they, automate driving. And all of this has to do with the fact that no, those jobs are not going to come back. And we're actually going to lose more jobs as, AI takes over a lot more of the repetitive, both, physical and cognitive tasks that can be done. But when you say that, it didn't work, well, actually, this neoliberal global capitalist system worked just fine for the ruling elite. I mean, they made out like, bandits, right? I mean, it's just untold wealth, untold riches, untold power. So it worked very, very well. It was a disaster for the rest of us, for the rest of humanity. But actually, that's the system itself is an ongoing disaster. It's an ongoing disaster. We look at this, huge pile of rubble, and we know that there are people who are benefiting from this. So it worked just fine, and it worked as it is supposed to work. But what we're describing here in the loss of, or the immiseration, the damage to the working class, especially the industrial working class, is, this is the functioning of monopoly capital. Capital looks for the cheapest wages. It will travel all over the world and go to wherever the wages are cheap. And it went to China. Now, the thing to understand about China is from 1980 until about the current moment, yes, China obtained a lot of industrial jobs because the industries were offshored to China. But at the same time, Chinese industrial wages went up 150-fold. I'm not talking 150%. They went up 150-fold. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's the largest transfer of wealth, if you will, to the working classes in the world, which is why China has ended poverty. And on the other hand, the US was also making out like bandits on this. But in the US side, it was the largest transfer of wealth to the ruling elite. And that's why China is doing well. And that's why the United States is circling the drain. Now, as I said, this is the logic of monopoly capital, is that it takes over everything. Once it is a monopoly, it is so big and powerful, it can buy and sell politicians, get the legislation that it wants. But more than that, it does not have to do anything to make money. Because on the one hand, it's so impoverished the working class that the working class no longer has the capacity to buy anything that it's making. And on the other hand, because of its monopoly power, it can simply gouge those who are still left standing. And having had these huge monopoly profits, what it does is it simply financialize itself. It puts its money into financial products, financial techniques that simply gouge rent from anybody else who is left standing, or anybody else that it can drive into the dirt with its, extraordinary power. And so that's why it's not going to work. That's why it's not going to bring back jobs. And that's why, if you look at the long arc of history, if you look at the big picture, that notion that capitalism beat communism in the form of the USSR was a misnomer, it was misguided, because actually they defeated each other. And as I said, capitalism has been on its last legs since the 70s, certainly since the 1990s. And in 2008, the death certificate was pronounced. But now it is simply going on in this zombie phase. And it thinks that by, pushing China around, by opening new markets, that it can somehow keep itself staggering along until, the next major crisis, which is simply an ongoing one.
Yeah. KJ, why does China keep pumping fentanyl into America? That's what my president says, that China
Yeah.
keeps flooding us with fentanyl, which is the reason why he's putting on the tariffs on China.
Yeah, I think we have to make this very, very clear. China is not exporting any fentanyl to the United States. It has put bans on 46 precursor chemicals to fentanyl, because before the allegation was, well, you're not sending fentanyl to the US, but you're selling, these generic uh, pharmaceutical chemicals that can be used to make fentanyl. Well, they're used across the board for a whole bunch of things in general. But China, put restrictions on all 46 of them. So it is trying its absolute best. But the US has a drug problem because, as I said, we're looking at massive immiseration. People are self medicating simply so they can get to the next day, just to survive. And on the other hand, we have the US pharmaceutical companies that made out like bandits by addicting people to fentanyl. And if the US was serious about fentanyl, it would remove fentanyl from Schedule 2 and put it onto Schedule 1 and simply ban it. They could do that, but they're not doing that. And so they just want a convenient scapegoat. China is responsible for everything that's wrong with the United States. There's never any level of self, awareness, self scrutiny, self, criticism. And so it's just a cheap target that they're going to use as a pretext to blame China for domestic woes that are created by the contradictions of the US system and continue to escalate. Just one more parenthetical remark, Jamal.
Please.
The country that had the world's worst drug problem on the planet was China. In 1949,
Opium.
when the People's Republic was started, they started off not simply with massive poverty and massive, destruction after, you know, uh, s- you know, uh, a century of colonization or partial colonization, but they had the world's largest opium addiction problem.
Hmm.
That 90 million people, about a fifth of the population of China, was addicted to opium. It was completely destroyed. Why did that happen? Because the Western powers sold opium against China's massive resistance.
Right.
They had two opium wars. They forced the Chinese to accept the trade of opium, and Hong Kong was the staging ground. It was the port from where all this opium was trafficked. It was essentially a trafficking platform. And the great US East Coast fortunes became rich from this opium trafficking. The Ivy League schools, they all made their money from opium endowments. We're talking about, Princeton, Columbia, Harvard. All of these schools became these, world-class institutions because they had money pouring through them through the destruction of China through opium. After the People's Republic of China was started, they got rid of their opium problem in 4 years. By 1953, they got rid of the problem of opium addiction.
Now, how did China do it?
That's the question. And the thing is, if China can do it, the US can do it too. And
Different
this,
systems. I mean, like it's. I get the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong. It, when I look at our society, I look at things like, do people have enough money to pay their bills? Are people stressed? Can they pay for their kids? Can they pay for their car? Basically, can they afford to pay for a life? And if the answer is no, then those people typically get in survival mode, and it creates all sorts of difficulties, not just economic but also internal. Like this notion of like you said, miseration. When you put people in difficult situations, those people respond. I always say like difficult situations don't necessarily make beautiful people. Those people struggle. Drugs is a gateway, right? It's the out. It's a momentary release from your daily struggle and strife. And it's one thing if the U.S. says, okay, we're going to make sure people have education, we're going to make sure people have healthcare, we're going to make sure that the basic necessities of life are at the very least inexpensive and they can have access to them. Basically, we're going to create a haven for people who are self-actualized. That is not what we do. I mean, when you're looking at somebody driving an Uber and working another job and having a kid, okay, well, what is the person's life like? What is the conditions that the person is functioning under? And yeah, they may not be horrible, but I would imagine that they are not necessarily in the best, let's say, state of things. And you multiply that by 320 million people, where you get the majority of people who are basically struggling to make ends meet. It is stress. I know my mom went through it. Like, you're trying to raise a kid by yourself. You're working a job that is not paying exactly what you needed to pay. So you're borrowing from one to the other. You go through issues of depression, issues of worth. Like all of that stuff comes into play just being a person in a society that doesn't necessarily seem to care all that much about the person. And so if China decided, okay, well, we're going to do something different, I guess my point is these are different systems. China's systems seem to be more biased towards person. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, though. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm getting
yeah.
talking out my
Well,
ass.
no. I think you're absolutely right. China's system is based on people. It's focused on people. It's a people-centered governance system, whereas the U.S. is a profit-centered
Right.
governance system. So people matter in China, and so when the PRC, decided that it was going to tackle this issue of 90 million people addicted to opium who were not functional in their society, what did they do? The first thing they said is, this is not an individual problem. Like
Yes.
here, it's always, it's blamed back on the individual, right? There's some kind of individual failing. There's something wrong with you. That's why
Right.
you are on drugs. In China, they saw it as a national failing. And therefore, it required a national response, a whole of size society response. So what did they do? The first thing they did was they gave everybody land. Land reform was the basis for the transformation of society and certainly the transformation of their drug problem. Can you imagine if you gave everybody who was homeless in the United States and possibly, using drugs, if you gave everybody a home,
No.
do you think they would be using drugs?
It
Certainly a lot
depends.
less, right? It depends, but certainly a lot less. I mean, I had a colleague who was a social worker, she was going to Johns Hopkins, and as part of her training, they sent her out for 1 week to live with the homeless, as part of her training as a social worker.
Yeah.
That was several decades ago. She is still traumatized to this day. And this was a person, who had all the resources, who was simply play acting at homelessness for a week. And she's still traumatized. Can you imagine what it is like for somebody, who's, a regular person finds themselves on the streets?
I can't.
In very short order, you are
Yeah.
going to end up with mental illness. You are going to have to self medicate. And so think of the converse where you are taken out of that situation. The government decides that it is going to have a whole of society approach to solving your problems, where the entire country comes together. You give everybody land, you give everybody food, you give everybody shelter and clothing, and you give them education, and you give them society, you give them a community, and you give them meaning. If you do that, you can get rid of drug problems, in 3 years, in 4 years, like the Chinese did. If
Yeah.
you don't do that and you just continue to individualize and blame the victims of the system, you're not going to get anywhere. Instead, you're going to have the simple, kind of churn of the nonprofit industry enriching itself while not making any difference, while the rest of the society continues to, fall apart. And
Yeah.
so I think, the issue really is, where do you put your focus? Who do you blame? What do you see as the root? And how do you change it? If you have the right lens, if you have the right understanding, you can change that. And the US could do that too. It could deal with the conditions that create addiction, but it won't. And instead, it chooses to blame the individuals domestically, and then it wants to scapegoat other countries because it sees that its strategy is to blame others. It's never my fault. Blame others, create, a scapegoat, a false target, and at the same time escalate against that target in the hopes that this escalation will also have beneficial effects.
Yeah, we don't get into why the person is on drugs. Like that, like to me, that would be the most operative thing in the world, right? Okay, why is this person using? Is there something in this person's material conditions that is incentivizing this person to do this? There was a guy who's doing experimentation on people who are drug addicts. And what he pointed out was oftentimes it's the living conditions that the people are in that drives the behavior. Meaning it's not like this person is just addicted to drugs and they can't get off of it. It's more so they're living in a situation, and once they get out of prison, going back to the exact situation that they were living in before, what do you expect the outcome to be? No, I agree with you. Give people a house, give people, something to do with their time, give them a life, allow them to, like you said, give them community. You have a far better chance of pulling that person away from whatever the material conditions were that got them into those drugs, as opposed to just letting them go back or putting them in a cage. That's the other thing, right? It's your fault. We're going to put you in a cage, et cetera, et cetera. No, I agree with you, KJ.
And
One,
stop palming over these drugs. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies made out like bandits
yes, they
by
did.
overprescribing, by prescribing at a drop of a hat, simply to palliate the system and just get them out, of their offices, while the doctors wanted them out of their offices, while the pharmaceutical industry was making out like bandits.
See, I have mixed feelings on this because as somebody who I'll disclose for transparency. When I was 17, kidney failure. By the time I was 19, I was so off the reservation in regards to just blowing off issues of health and constraints that I ended up with neuropathy at around 19. Lost the ability to walk. I had to relearn to walk. The nerves in my legs, feet had disintegrated. And it took like 10 years for that to normalize, where I could walk normally, all that good stuff. The sensory nerves never came back. And because the sensory nerves never came back, I interpreted it as pain. And so gabapentin, tramadol, and I ended up effectively taking tramadol because tramadol is the only thing that effectively works for it. When the federal government decided, oh, we need to crack down on this, at that point, doctors started to get very dodgy about prescribing pain meds, even to people who needed it. And so despite the fact that I had been on it since I was 19, meaning there's a proven track record of me using this in order to deal with neuropathic pain, my doctor was like, I'm uncomfortable prescribing it now. And even went so far as to say, hey, maybe you don't even really need it. Okay, so you've been prescribing something for the last 15 years that I don't need. Is that what you're trying to communicate to me? Like, there are times where people actually need the pain meds. And because of the way that the federal government has decided to crack down on it, people who need it are not getting it. And some of those people are committing suicide. Some of those people are using harder drugs. So they go to heroin or something like that in order to effectively deal with pain that should have been treated through a doctor, who doctors are no longer willing to do. I get it, right? Like the Sackler family, they're trying to make a buck, and drug companies were trying to make a buck, and they were giving out this stuff like candy, even in cases where it wasn't necessarily necessary. But I'm conflicted on this because I know as a flat fact, people who actually need it and can't get it. And I know that's personal, but still, I don't think the story for me is somehow unique to other people who actually require it, if that makes sense. And I don't know the middle ground for it. I
No,
really
no,
don't.
no, I don't disagree with you, Jamal. In your case, I think it was absolutely necessary. I mean, neuropathy is, a living hell, right?
Oh,
No,
dude, when
yeah,
it first started, I was literally taken to the ER every night for morphine shots to just go to sleep.
yeah.
And I think it was maybe 5 nights of doing that. The doctor was like, okay, this is unsustainable. You can't keep this up. You have to find a way to manage the pain in a way that basically doesn't bring you here to the ER. It was vicious. Even today, I still take tramadol and gabapentin for it. There's no way around it. It's, you're just stuck with it. But I guess my thing is, I don't want people who need meds to not get those meds because of some kind of political thing where it's like, okay, we went too far in the wrong direction, so now we're going to screw over people who need the meds.
No,
I do agree with you.
that's not what I'm arguing, Jamal. And
No,
I'm
no, I
not
don't
saying
think you are.
there
I don't
should
think you
be, black and white, approach to this.
are. Yeah,
People need the meds that they need, but what we do know is that, the pharmaceutical companies
yeah,
were overprescribing, often in cases where it was not necessary because they were making windfall profits. Now,
yeah.
talking about
Agreed.
chronic pain, I've had chronic pain for decades because of, post-operative conditions due to
Mhm.
military injuries. So I know what that is all about. But at the same time, once again, it's easy to say this, but I always think we need to look at the bigger picture.
Mhm.
Uh, should you or should anyone have received better care? Could they have received better care that would possibly diminish the need for palliative care in terms of pain medication? Sometimes it's not possible, but in the ideal situations, we would receive, uh, you know, medical support and medical screening and medical testing that would ideally head off some of these extraordinary, painful conditions.
That's
And
fair.
then, as necessary, people should receive the medical palliation that they need, including painkillers. I'm not opposed to any of that,
Mhm.
but we do know that if we look at society in general and we look at the pain of society in general, what we see is a spectrum where people are simply trying to manage their pain through painkillers, pain that is really social harm and social pain. There's no
Agreed.
use for that.
Yeah.
And then there's also overprescription because it fits the agenda of the pharmaceutical companies, the corporations that make windfall profits off of that. And then the other piece, and I think this is where we can think of pain as a metaphor, is we live in a society where the pain of the working class, of the pain of the majority of people, is not felt by the ruling class. Like
Yeah.
it's similar to Hansen's disease, leprosy, where damage at the extremities is no longer sensed by the brain, and therefore you just end up hurting yourself more and more. You lose fingers, you lose toes, you lose your extremities because those pain signals are no longer felt. And I think that is the thing that we need to shift, that the ruling class needs to understand that there is pain, there's
Yeah.
unbelievable pain happening in the working class, uh, and they need to do something about it rather than trying to block those pain signals through palliative measures and through projection and through lies and through mystification and
Oh,
propaganda.
that's so good, KJ. Yeah, I agree with you. What did they say? I think it was a Princeton study that only less than 1% of what the public wants is articulated through the political space, that the public just fundamentally gets ignored. And if you look at Democrats today, they're like, we're doing everything right. We just need more messaging. Like they don't, there's a disconnect between, okay, what is the working class and what does the public want versus what do they get on the other end? It's wow. It's been that way for a while, but it seems to be getting
they,
worse.
they don't need more messaging. They need to listen. They need to
Mhm.
listen. And that's what has not been happening.
KJ No, man, I always appreciate these conversations, KJ. KJ No is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. He was contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is available at iacenter.org. And KJ, where can people find you?
People can find my work on the China Report on the Breakthrough News Network. And we have just released a show about China's health insurance system, where people can go on and see what it looks like when you have a government that listens and that is responsive to the needs of its people, and what that translates into in a medical context.
That was a video you sent me. Oh, I got to watch that. I got to watch that. KJ, man, thank you for this. I really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. Always a
You be
pleasure.
safe, man. Have a good one. All right.